this program is an opportunity to introduce the new Jackson Center and Justice Jackson as local hero on the grandest scale to this audience. And so what I'm doing is, see how the time limit hits me, but probably about 6 moments in his life and career and work that exhibit, I think, qualities that contribute to what we call heroism in the end. From his work as a young lawyer defending some labor radicals in this town who vandalized the streetcar poles, to his first big event when he went to Washington in 1934, which was prosecuting a civil tax case against Andrew Mellon, his defense of the Roosevelt court packing plan, his then moving into the Supreme Court phase, his dissent in the Korematsu case, the internment of Japanese Americans, Nuremberg, obviously, and then race. Brown versus Board of Education a little bit, but actually another case that I think is more revealing of his heart and thinking about racial issues in the early 1950s.
Okay, so then he was an advocate for racial
yes, he was, but in an individualistic way that's pretty typical of all his work. He struggled, and he struggled visibly, which is, I think, a good thing in a judge, to sort of show your work and show your thinking. He struggled visibly with whether the court was the proper institution to force society forward on issues of racial justice, or whether the political branches, Congress and the president, were more appropriate places. And if the court was going to take the step, as they ultimately did in Brown, whether the court could credibly claim to be doing it simply in the name of the 14th Amendment, or whether the court should more explicitly say that this is part of political progress in this country and full participation in American democracy. In the end, he's part of the 9 unanimous judges in Brown versus Board of Education. I think the opinion of the court is not quite as candid as Jackson would have written it, but it's a group project authored by Chief Justice Warren. But Jackson very much was part of that.
Okay. Now, how did you become? Because I guess you're one of the main scholars of Jackson's work.
Well, I'm spending a lot of my time and energy on it. We'll see where the work stands up in the end. I got interested in him, I guess, first the way every law student and lawyer gets exposed to him is through his words, the opinions he wrote as a Supreme Court justice, which are ringing, brilliant, rhetorical gems. I mean, his words are just more interesting than most other justices who have ever served. And so that kind of exposure immediately kind of makes a mark. And then I worked as a prosecutor before I became a law professor, and worked in the Department of Justice, a place where he served in 4 different positions as he climbed the ladder up to Attorney General as his last position. And he, as an exemplar of the right way to be a federal prosecutor, to be a public official, to be the government, pervades the place. I mean, part of the interesting thing is that when you head a component, your portrait goes on the wall. And since he headed 4 different things, tax, antitrust, solicitor general, attorney general, you see his portrait a lot. And I got, I guess, more exposure to some of his work, a particular speech he gave about the ethics of prosecuting. And when I went into teaching, some of the stuff I was teaching and writing about was right up that alley, so I started to dig into him as a research project, and found plenty to keep me interested.
Okay. Now, you said you're going to talk a little bit about what he did as a lawyer in the area. He was a lawyer here for about 21 years.
Yeah. Is that right? 1913 to 1934.
Okay.
So, yeah.
And now, are there any specific moments there that you...
Well, I'm going to talk about one particular moment, his first case. It's a criminal case where he defends what come to be known as the street railway strikers. Street Railway was the streetcar company here in Jamestown. And there was a strike in 1912-13 that paralyzed the city and was it's kind of hard for us today in a relatively placid labor management climate to remember what labor management issues could be like and were like back then. But this was a very active community-wide event, and because it was the main transportation in the city, it affected everybody. And Jackson was a young apprentice. He'd had a year at Albany Law School, but he was not yet admitted to the bar. He was working in the office of a lawyer named Frank Mott, who was his teacher, apprentice, and actually a distant cousin. And Mott got appointed to the State Public Service Commission right as a particular event happened in the street railway strike. A large group of workers were arrested for vandalism. It was basically part of their efforts to make management meet their demands and improve their pay. They chopped down all the poles that held up all the wires that made the streetcars go. And that's vandalism and various other things, and that's a crime. So a whole bunch of them get arrested, and Frank Mott is initially representing a couple of them, and then Mott has to leave because he's going to Albany for the Public Service Commission job. And so young Bob Jackson, I think, no shrinking violet. He probably, even at age 20, was quite confident in his abilities and ready to go. Needs to get special permission of the court to take over the defense because he's not yet a lawyer.
Right.
So it's his first case, really, before he's admitted to the bar, but he's permitted to do it by the court. And he works out, a very balanced resolution for a large group of clients, most of whom were unquestionably guilty of the act, but they were being aggressively over-prosecuted because of the political context that surrounded the case. So I think one of the things it goes to is the sort of courage to take a step alone. I think that's part of heroism, and taking the side of the unpopular as a kid lawyer and so forth is part of that. And another element of heroism, I think, is having a sense of justice or proportion in the context of an event. And here, really, as a criminal defense lawyer, which is not something he did much of in his career, he works out a pretty balanced and fair solution that's good for his clients, good for his community, satisfactory to the prosecutor, impressive to the judge, and so forth. So the sort of courage to get into the fight and the sense of justice in resolving the fight are the two aspects that I think that little moment illuminates.
Okay. Now,
Probably we've discussed it for longer than I'll be able to discuss it on Wednesday already.
That's fine. I also was wondering how, I guess it feels you studying Jackson to have the center opening and
it's
basically a museum.
It's tremendous. I mean, it's serendipity plus that this kind of community effort, that this kind of center is being created, that people like Greg and his colleagues are here as a contact and a resource and encouragement. I mean, it kind of ratifies and validates my interest in Jackson, and I think to a degree I perform a function like that for some of the people involved in the center. And I think what we've all found in the different paths that brought us here is somebody who, deserves it. He's been dead almost 50 years. And, a lot of people, once their time is passed, are passed. Robert Jackson, in a very interesting way, becomes more important as his time recedes further into the past.
And do you think that's because of his impact on Nuremberg and international law?
I think that's the starting point. I think that's the thing that he called the most significant work of his life, and it certainly is an absolutely monumental achievement in a completely unique role. There's nobody else who did anything like that who will ever get to be the first person to be the chief prosecutor at an effort to impose a lawful resolution through criminal process on defeated foes for crimes against humanity, aggressive war, etc. But I think Nuremberg is really just the sort of headline that grabs people, or maybe what people know and remember about Jackson. And from that entry, you get to the much fuller story of his career, and frankly, the part that consistently fascinates me, the man himself, which isn't just the law, which isn't just the jobs, the events that he did in his practice, but really the life he lived, the kinds of activities and interests and relationships and writing and speaking and community involvement. I mean, he was the real deal, and so as a kind of an exemplar of a classic American type, I put him on a very short list. I mean, you kind of have George Washington, you have Abraham Lincoln, you have Franklin Roosevelt, you have Theodore Roosevelt. You can add 5 or 10 more names of your own, but one of them should be Robert Jackson.
Now, the area is kind of multiracial, so I think if you could talk a little bit about his stance on race relations too.
Well, I mean, he is a guy who grew up in, pre-Brown versus Board of Education America in, very, all white environments generally. And so I think over his life, a guy of liberal sensibilities and non-discrimination met new contexts where that required him to sort of think out and do things that made choices that were defining, is really how I'd put it. It starts as early as, I'm not sure I can point to an event in Jamestown, but certainly when he comes to Washington and he's in the Treasury Department and in the Department of Justice, Washington is a segregated city, and the legal institutions of Washington are segregated. Robert Jackson is the guy who desegregates the Bar Association in the District of Columbia, just because it's the right thing to do. You've got white lawyers in this town, and you've got black lawyers in this town, and they all use law books. They should all be able to get them in the same library. That's a sort of stroke of the pen thing that he was able to do once he became Attorney General, but it's a fight he didn't have to pick. It wasn't his job, but he just had an impulse that it was the right thing to do. On the Supreme Court, his sense of judicial role was to some extent a constraint, because the government is limited by the Constitution, private conduct isn't, and so forth. But in the sort of test context that you can point to, Japanese-American internment, where he dissented from the Supreme Court upholding it, school segregation, where he was part of the unanimous court striking it down, some other, sort of fact-specific contexts, grand juries that were racially segregated. He always was on the side of integration. So I think it's an area where he had a certain character and personal commitment, and found ways to translate that into what his job allowed him to do.
Now, do you have any plans for a book? Or
yeah, I'm working on 2 projects. One project is actually, in a way, collaborative with Justice Jackson. He had written, but not completed, a memoir of his relationship with and work for President Franklin Roosevelt. And it's something that has been in Jackson's family and incomplete. And I've, with their help, taken on the project of buffing, polishing, assembling it a little bit, and I think in the next year there will be a book by Robert Jackson about FDR, and that project has been a delight to work on. As Jackson's original work, as FDR as subject matter. I mean, it's great. Beyond that, what I'm working on is a biographical account of his work at Nuremberg. There's a large Nuremberg literature, but it tends to be the courtroom story. Sort of looking through the camera at the courtroom, and there's Jackson in the courtroom as the prosecutor, and his cross-examination of this, and his statement of that, and his opening and closing speeches, which are masterful. But I think there's not a good internal understanding of him. There's not really a good study of what it was to be Robert Jackson at Nuremberg, the things he wrestled with, the decisions he made, and so that's the book that I'm taking on.
Now, can you talk a little bit about his relationship with FDR? I know it's.
Sure.
I was reading that they went fishing together, played cards together.
They did all of those things. I mean, it actually was quite a long contact. Jackson was first introduced to FDR in 1912, when Jackson was a student at Albany Law School and Roosevelt was in his first term as a New York State Senator. So they were both in Albany. may have been the fall of 1911, actually. And Roosevelt picked a fight with the Tammany Hall political machine over who the legislature would elect to be the next senator from the state of New York. It was before voters got to pick senators. State legislators picked senators in those days. And FDR, as a rookie senator, was kind of a celebrity and a good show. And Jackson, as a law student, I think a little bit bored with his classroom, went to the legislature to watch. And through this fellow Mott, got introduced, and had the acquaintance then. Jackson comes back to Jamestown, and when he turns 21, he's eligible to get elected to be a Democratic committeeman. So he runs and he wins. And from that point on, in addition to his law practice, he's quite involved in New York State Democratic politics. FDR is Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Jackson and Mott travel to Washington a few times and meet with Roosevelt there. That's 1913, 14, 15, and so forth. Roosevelt then is out of office. He gets polio. He's off the scene a bit. But from 1924 forward, when FDR is back in political life, from 28 to 32 when he's governor, Jackson, as a major lawyer and a major political player in the state of New York, although he never ran for anything other than the committeeman position, have increasing contacts. And Roosevelt grows to impress Jackson as he grew to impress everybody, and Jackson impressed Roosevelt increasingly. Once Roosevelt's in Washington, pretty quickly the hand reaches back to try and pull Jackson down to Washington. And after a little bit of bickering about this position and that position, Jackson comes down to be the general counsel in what we would call the IRS today, the Revenue Bureau in Treasury, and very quickly becomes a sort of inside advisor of the president. He's working on front burner issues that are beyond really the turf of the Revenue Office, that are kind of government law and economic policy issues. And he starts spending time at the White House, advising the president, doing drafts, having meetings, writing speeches. And Roosevelt takes an incredible shine to Jackson, and Jackson obviously greatly admires the president and works for him. And Roosevelt promotes him up through a series of positions of greater and greater responsibility, up until he's Attorney General. And then in Roosevelt's third term, he appoints Jackson to the Supreme Court. After that point in time, where Jackson leaves the administration and goes on to the court, the relationship becomes almost exclusively social. Still regular, but in those last years, Roosevelt's obviously a war president. It's not like he's goofing off, but on occasion, card games and fishing trips and so forth. But that was late in the game. Much earlier in the game, there was detailed, substantive interaction on everything you could imagine, from tax policy to enforcing the antitrust laws, to judicial appointments, to federal criminal prosecution, to government appointments, soup to nuts.
Okay. And now, I also read that FDR actually wanted him to run for New York State governor.
Right, he did.
Really
only as a stepping stone. Right. I don't think it was so important that he make Jackson a governor, but in that time period, this is 1937, 1938, Roosevelt fastened on Robert Jackson as the person who was one of the true New Dealers, who was best suited to be his successor as president. Roosevelt intended to go home to Hyde Park after 2 terms, to sort of be like Jefferson at Monticello, a retired president on his estate, writing great thoughts, farming, and so forth. And the fight within the Democratic Party, this is a bit of an oversimplification, was between the New Dealers and the machine, urban, traditional Democrats, Tammany and counterpart machine Democrats throughout the country. And Roosevelt, 2 things really happened. Roosevelt stays in himself. The successor to FDR as the champion of the New Deal is FDR rather than anybody else. And over time, Roosevelt and the New Deal loses some steam, and the the sort of machine, what I'm calling machine Democrat interests, do get to have more say. And that's ultimately where Harry Truman comes from, as Roosevelt's running mate in 44.
Now, did Jackson not running for state governor, do you think influence FDR's decision to stay on for the 4 terms?
I think FDR's decision to run in 1940, I mean, that's a big historical question. He claimed to be undecided and to be drafted by the convention in Chicago in July of 1940. I think, in fact, he was, running and strategizing behind the scenes all along. I think the predominant reason he was doing so was the impending war. Even if he couldn't quite put it that bluntly to the American people, this country was going to get embroiled in the war that was already engulfing Europe. And I think Roosevelt felt a responsibility to keep his hand on the tiller in that moment. In addition, to the extent the legacy of the New Deal could be continued into a 3rd term, I think Roosevelt recognized that the best champion of the New Deal was Mr. New Deal, and so that too was a reason why he stayed in. So it wasn't that Jackson wasn't in a proper position, for in fact, in the spring of 1940 as Attorney General, Jackson is the name on everybody's lips. If Roosevelt doesn't run, who's going to be the Democratic nominee? Well, there are 4 or 5 or 6 names everybody's talking about, and one of them is Attorney General Jackson. Attorney General used to be an office. I mean, the cabinet generally used to be offices from which people had the potential to be national electoral candidates in a way that we don't really have right now. I mean, nobody expects John Ashcroft to run for president or Janet Reno to run for president. But in those days, the Attorney General was, by position, placed to do that. And Jackson, by reputation, by personality, by ability, was positioned to do that. But he wasn't going to run against FDR.
Yeah. I had 2 other questions. One was Jackson disappointed that he was never able to be the Chief Justice?
That's a complicated question. I'm not sure I've fully worked that out. I think my tentative answer would be yes, in a way. Because I think the deal that Jackson had and the terms on which he felt comfortable leaving the executive branch and leaving the potential of seeking elected office was a promise from FDR that I put you on the court as an Associate Justice now, and when Chief Justice Stone, who I'm appointing simultaneously, he's a Republican, a Hoover justice, and in the interest of national unity, remember 1941, war is coming, but Stone was old and clearly didn't have a lot of miles left in him. Once Stone's time has come and gone, you will be the next chief. And in a time period where Chief Justice really was of national political significance, of real co-equal importance, foregoing a political path and the prospect of being president to be Chief Justice was probably an even deal. I mean, William Howard Taft went from one job to the other. Charles Evans Hughes missed being elected president by a whisker in 1916, became Chief Justice in the Hoover administration. Bob Jackson took the court as an Associate Justice in 41, but fully expected, because Roosevelt had told him explicitly, that you will be Chief Justice. Unfortunately, Stone outlived Roosevelt. Truman picked Vinson rather than Jackson, so it gets very complicated at that point. And so I'm tentatively of the mind that Jackson had regrets in this area. Were they bitter regrets? I don't think so. I think he wasn't a guy for a lot of bitterness. I think he was a guy to move forward, and generally a person of very positive outlook, an optimist at heart. He also, by being asked by Truman and going to Nuremberg, got to do something with his life, legal career, and talents that probably is bigger than being Chief Justice of the United States. So, if he could have had both, I'm sure he would have been pleased. But I don't think he lived with many regrets.
Now, do you think he should have stepped down during the Nuremberg trials, or because I know that created a lot of resentment in the court.
The court was already a bit more than a bit of a fractious place, and he wasn't delighted being on the court in those sort of 1942, 43, 44 into 1945 years. Colleague issues and the general irrelevance of the Supreme Court to the World War that was the work of the rest of the nation. One of the things that Jackson did in a kind of flip comment note was that the morning after Pearl Harbor, as Roosevelt prepared to address the joint session of Congress and ask for a declaration of war, and Germany's declaring war on the United States, and Congress is beginning to do appropriations for a massive ramp up of defense construction, and American boys are lined up down the block to enlist. The Supreme Court heard a case about the deductibility of country club fees paid by corporations for its officers. What a load of crap in the scheme of things. And Bob Jackson didn't like wasting his time on stuff that didn't really matter. And I think his view was, the war mattered, and some of the stuff on the court didn't matter nearly. And so the call to go to Nuremberg was a chance to sort of enlist in the war effort, in the last best part of the war effort, really, the correct way to win, a lawful process at a victory. Should he have stepped down? Well, some of his colleagues thought so. They said various sniping things. There were a number of cases that were 4-4 divisions that had to be put over for another year. But, the work of the court caught up in the end. And Jackson came back and served a very distinguished 7 additional years, and really found a kind of new voice and a new place in the court and in American jurisprudence. So for us, I think it was a good deal that he didn't step down. For the court during that 12-month period, there were some bumps, but they got over them.
Yeah, so it's probably part of what makes him a hero then, right?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, I think today it would be unlikely that any justice would take a job that required him or her to be away for a year. Since Jackson went to Nuremberg, the only real collateral job that a Supreme Court justice has taken on was Chief Justice Warren, heading the Warren Commission after Kennedy's assassination. And that was extremely special. Even that didn't work extremely smoothly for the court. But I think, in general, other than their constitutional responsibilities, justices today have a view that one shouldn't take a break from the court. But if your country needs you in a very special circumstance, I think it's a good thing for a citizen to say yes.
Yeah. He was able to get some respect back, because he was, I think I read, the only justice who all the other justices, when he died, went to his funeral, I believe.
I believe that's right. It's certainly the most distant road trip that they've all taken. I don't know if it's true that there's never been another 8 justices in attendance, but it's one thing to go to the National Cathedral in Washington. It's another thing to get on a train to come to Jamestown and then go to Frewsburg and be at the gravesite. And so that was a fairly special statement. I mean, one of the things that the Jackson Center is on its way to restoring is the memory of how significant Robert Jackson was. I mean, he was huge. I mean, there's really no way to understand it other than to read the newspapers from the time period. But when you look at the spring of 1940 and the way the public eye viewed him as Attorney General and where he could go and what he meant in that position, he was a giant. And it's nice to be part of restoring and reminding and teaching that to a next generation. Okay.
You said you had some questions too.
Do you want questions from me, or then I'm going to talk to John for a long time.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah, actually, I had some questions for you too. So.
1908. So Jackson was 16 years old at the time. I'll steal one of my surprises that Greg would otherwise learn about on Wednesday. Jackson himself gave some kind of talk at Chautauqua in 1917 when he was a young man. On George Washington and Abraham Lincoln.
Oh, wow.
He then was present once in 1929 and once in 1936 when Roosevelt spoke at Chautauqua. First time he was kind of a guy in the entourage. The second time he was the VIP at Roosevelt's side when Roosevelt gave the I Hate War speech. And then in 1947, after Nuremberg, Jackson did talk about his work at Nuremberg in a variety of places, but one of the places he went out of his way to schedule, and I think one of the places where he said some of his most careful, thoughtful, and beautiful words about Nuremberg was at Chautauqua. So we're following his footsteps literally at Chautauqua itself, and that's another nice angle on the event.
We'll talk about this. Is that going to be part of your speech? Or they have a Q&A section, and we may have just a softball thrown at us. In your research, if you located anything about Jackson and Chautauqua, it would be the perfect segment.
That'd be great. Yeah,
that's interesting because their historian had sent a couple of items, but just captured the last couple.
Right. Okay.
I think that's
What do you want to know about it? Anything else?
I think
Want to know what baseball team he roots for?
Yeah, what team?
The Milwaukee Brewers.
Interesting. Why is that?
Well, they're America's team.
I
No, I
see.
grew up in Milwaukee. And here's a.
I'm a Yankees fan.
Don't
myself,
repeat this at
so.
Chautauqua, but the one of the founders of Chautauqua was Reverend Miller, and they have a place on the ground dedicated to his memory. One of the major breweries in Milwaukee is Miller. There are a lot of things with Miller's name on it. They built a new stadium in Milwaukee, and I was visiting family and got to go to a game, and Miller Park and Miller Park. And they're very different.
They're very different. They wouldn't want to associate a beer with Chautauquans.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much.
I also did want to know what you guys thought of the Nuremberg movie on TNT. I don't know if you saw it. This is just.
He wrote a critique on it. So
Yeah, I wrote a little piece on it, so you could look that up.
Okay,
It's on www.findlaw.com in a area called WRIT, W-R-I-T, in the archive there. I think it was pretty good, I guess is where I come out. It was a good effort to bring an important topic to a general audience, and particularly the courtroom scenes were true to the record and were powerful and well presented, and some of the acting was brilliant. Some of the collateral stuff was a little bit incomplete historically, a little bit, I think, hard for the viewer to quite figure out what's this about, but I think that's more the limit of television and not a flaw in the production. So I thought it was a good effort, and I've been impressed by how many people saw it. I mean, in the years since it aired, as I go around and talk to people about Jackson and Nuremberg, it clearly reached an audience, and so by that standard, it did something pretty good.
Well, thank you very much. It's been more than helpful.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
Good to
you.
see you.
You too. Thank you very much.
Good to see you.
And odds are I'm going to be covering the speeches on Wednesday too.
Oh, okay. Great.
Maybe I'll try and catch you afterwards then.
Okay.
All right. Thank you very
Terrific.
much.
Look forward to
Thank
seeing
you.
you then.
This is for the team.
Oh, okay.
This is for the team. And I'm going to ask you, talk to me about the book, the Robert Jackson book. And this is private archive, so this will not be...
Okay. About the Roosevelt book?
Yeah, the Roosevelt book, yeah.
Okay. Well, the first thing to tell you is that...
The whole background.
Okay. I have a copy for you in the trunk of my car over at the Fenton, so I wish I had it right here to hand across the table. It's not done, but it's in a shape where I'm, looking for your reactions and feedback, and happy for you to see it. Here's the story of the book. Obviously, the Roosevelt-Jackson relationship given. We know that general story. Jackson, for a guy who I think was, eloquent and emotional, was visibly marked by Roosevelt's death. He actually gave two eulogies, in a sense. One was a speech at the Department of Justice. Roosevelt died on Thursday afternoon, April 12th. On a Friday, April 13th, they did a memorial service at the Department of Justice and invited Justice Jackson to be the keynoter, in effect. Biddle was the Attorney General. And Jackson, who had learned, like everybody, about the president's death on Thursday, had been unable to work on Friday, hadn't gone into the court, had stayed home at Hickory Hill, and had gotten a call, I guess, in the morning inviting him to come and say something. So he sat down and wrote, and his wife, Irene, typed his speech for the Department of Justice that Friday. Mm-hmm. And then he went downtown to the Department of Justice, and in the Great Hall at Main Justice, which is a big but not enormous space. It's the biggest place in the building, and you can probably cram 300-400 people in there. They had well over 1,000, wow, hanging off the rafters and so forth. And it was an event, obviously, in tears, country in shock. And Jackson, the remarks you can read for yourself, he couldn't finish the remarks. He broke down at the end. And it's in the press accounts at the time that the last few sentences were inaudible, and he was choked up. Biddle, in his memoir of being Attorney General, refers to this event and says Bob Jackson was at his most eloquent, and a bit choked up. And so I think, political father-son might be too much of a schematic to force onto it. Big brother, little brother, leader, and loyal senior soldier. But whatever the dynamic, friends, whatever the dynamic was, that tie, that relationship, and the impact of that loss, I think is partly reflected in that speech and the little story about his giving that speech. That night, Friday night, April 13th, Jackson had a long-standing speaking engagement. The American Society for International Law has its annual meeting every spring in Washington, and he had agreed months earlier to give the major Friday evening address. The ASIL, I think, debated whether to cancel because of the president's death, and then went forward, and so Jackson spoke that night and gave a speech that he had written and worked on in the weeks leading up to it, on the topic of what to do with the Nazis after the victory. And it is the blueprint for Nuremberg. It's a speech that was entirely an individual effort by him. He wasn't, like consulting with the State Department personnel or the War Department personnel who were in various task force structures, kind of working on a war crimes concept. He wasn't privy to what they discussed at Yalta or at Tehran, where they discussed lining up 50,000 people and just shooting them. This was Jackson the lawyer, Jackson the justice, trying to think about what law in a context of victory should do to the defeated. And his speech calls for a real trial. He gives the speech and ad-libs a little bit about how the work that's to be done in this next phase, and the trial, if they can do one, will long outlive the leaders of today. Mm-hmm. And he gets choked up and has trouble speaking at that point, and then sort of continues his ad lib and says, that's a line that I wrote before the events of this week, obviously. So Roosevelt, like no other mentor, boss, leader, experience, relationship, I think defined and really, literally made in an employment sense, but in a character sense was that important to Bob Jackson.
Let me just stop for a second. When he gave that speech, with Sam Roseman,
Sam Roseman was in London. Okay. He was negotiating with the British. He came back and reported to Truman, and completely independently. I mean, it's interesting how these sort of things are in parallel but not aware of each other. Roseman comes back and says to Truman, it's a go on this thing that I've been working on for Roosevelt, if you want it to go, and then if you do, we need to think about who the lawyer is. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure who first suggests Jackson, but Jackson's the only candidate. As soon as that name is in play, Truman says, yes, we got to get him. Sends Roseman to recruit Jackson to be the prosecutor. And in that recruitment conversation, Jackson says, well, you need to know I've given this speech. And he hands over his ASIL remarks, which are, strikingly consistent with the general idea, not very well fleshed out, as it turns out, but the general idea of what Rosenman was there to ask him to do. But it wasn't, Jackson wasn't auditioning for anything, and he wasn't part of any planning effort. He just, sort of ended up in the same place. So it's a kind of, it's really an eerie coincidence.
I'm sorry.
No. It's a good part of the same time period. So Roosevelt's gone, and Jackson goes to Nuremberg, and that year we know, and one of the sort of Truman-related parts of that year is that he appoints Vinson rather than Jackson to be the next Chief Justice, and that provokes the so-called Black Jackson controversy, Jackson's telegram. At the end of all that, Jackson comes back to what he now knows is, his last job. He's home to be a Supreme Court justice, and unfortunately doesn't live long enough by anyone's standards. But he comes back, and I think Franklin Roosevelt and all of that is in the past, and he's aware and interested in reading the memoirs as other people start to write them. Francis Perkins, Jim Farley, Henry Stimson, Cordell Hull. I mean, it's a dozen or more people who are in the same inner circle kind of location, although maybe not the core circle where Jackson was, write Roosevelt memoirs. And Jackson, by the late 40s, is saying to people, including his son and his law clerk, I'm going to do one someday. But he's not really doing it. And he's in his late 50s. He's not short on time by anyone's standards. Although there is a history of the so-called Jackson heart in his family. And I think there's pretty good evidence that he had coronary disease as early as 1941. But I think, in a way we'd understand now, in a way he probably didn't understand then. So I don't think he thought his time was short, and he was really doing the work of the court, doing the extracurricular speaking and bar association and ABA committee chairing and so forth. And the Roosevelt Project was just, kind of on a back burner. Steel seizure case, spring of 1952, is coming on a pretty fast track to the court. And one of the things that the Solicitor General is invoking on behalf of the Truman administration as precedent for the Truman-Sawyer seizure of the steel mills is FDR's seizure of a munitions plant in California in 1941, which he had done pursuant to a legal opinion by Attorney General Robert H. Jackson. Okay. So Jackson's sitting on the bench May 12th and 13th, 1952, during this oral argument, and it's also in the briefing, so he'd sort of seen this coming. And the Solicitor General says, the authority to do this is exactly the same authority you told Roosevelt existed when he did that in the North American aviation case. And Jackson, as he writes in the introduction to that man, I'll get to that in a second, sort of is thinking and realizes he's the last living participant in the events. They were only 11 years earlier, but everybody else is gone. And the way he presents it is that it's sort of a service to history and necessary, given what he's hearing misrepresented by the Solicitor General in the steel seizure case. He needs to sort of set the record straight and sort of contribute what he can while he's still here. And so somewhat in the summer of 52, but more in the spring of 1953, he gets going on this project. And what he does is, sort of recreating it off drafts and scraps that I've spent a lot of time working with. It's sort of like almost Gettysburg Address-like. On the back of an envelope, he writes a title and a list of topics and a couple of things that become chapter headings. And he's just sort of like beginning to brainstorm and jot down, say something about this, touch on that. And his title is That Man. And his subtitle is something of Franklin D. Roosevelt and his administration. And that man is a reference back to the epithet that Roosevelt haters had used, particularly in the second term which is when Jackson really, came to full flower in his work for FDR. The sort of traitor to his class critique led people who couldn't even use his name to call him, that man in the White House. Yeah. And so the selection of the title by Jackson is a nice little twist and a turnaround on that. And he maps out an introduction plus 8 chapters. The introduction is basically his history, how he meets and hooks up with FDR, and how FDR develops and explains the relationship. And then the 8 chapters are that man in 8 particular roles. That man in the White House, that man is administrator, that man is commander-in-chief, that man is politician, that man is leader of the masses, that man is sportsman and companion, and so forth. And just like everything else in his court writing and his extrajudicial writing, Bob Jackson did his own work. I mean, he literally just picked up his dictaphone and turned out some stuff and then started editing it. And, the tape would go to Elsie, the type would come back, the markup would go to Elsie, the retype would come back, and so it went. And while he was getting started with this, really sort of the stretching exercise seems to have been a little article that he published in the Harvard Law Review in June of 1953, which is called a Presidential Legal Opinion. And it's the story of his opinion for FDR on the legality of an aspect of the Lend-Lease program. And the Harvard Law Review article reproduces a memo that FDR sent him saying, someday you need to tell this whole story. And so Jackson does that. That's a nice little story. And he's doing that in March and April of 1953. And the dates on the draft indicates that he's really gearing up on his That Man writing in May and June and July of 1953. Now, quick interlude. June of 1953 is when the Rosenbergs are executed. So there's an interruption. That becomes, an all-consuming, although kind of brief episode for the court. But it's in that time period that he's really, he's clearly looking at documents. He's looking at the oral history transcript that he's in the process of creating with a historian named Harlan Phillips, who's interviewing him at the time. I think he looks at some of the draft chapters that Gerhardt is exchanging with him. He's sort of immersing himself in material and then pouring it into his storytelling and writing about FDR. He gets as far as he gets in the summer of 1953. He goes to the Bohemian Grove at the end of that summer for his getaway vacation in late July and August, takes his new son-in-law, Boyden Craighill, with him, and comes back, 61 years old, still plenty of time, and he's really started on this project. The new term begins, and moving forward a few months, he has a big heart attack, or some size heart attack, on March 30th. He's in the hospital from March 30th until May 17th. He goes directly from the hospital to the bench for the deciding of Brown versus Board of Education, finishes the term, seems not to have gone back to the folder that's labeled Roosevelt Book. While he was taking it easy in the summer of 1954, he came up here and went fishing with some old buddies. He went out to California by train, the sort of slow way to travel of those days, for the Bohemian Grove, and he's under doctor's orders to be taking it easy. The one violation, and I think a major violation of doctor's orders, is that he is chairing the ABA Committee on the Administration of Criminal Justice. Basically, a total reworking of criminal law is the idea of this commission.
Is it Dr. Hurwitz, or is there a physician in Washington?
There's a physician in Washington named Paul Putsky, but he's seeing Dr. Hurwitz too. So I think those Hurwitz letters may speak to this time period. Yeah. And he never gets back to it. The term starts on October 5th, and he dies on October 9th. And so this folder with the multiple drafts of the different chapters, the pieces of That Man, and the folder's called Roosevelt Book, is there in the filing cabinet with other published and unpublished writings. And you can sort of find fingerprints and little references in some documents. Elsie Douglas, in the packing up of the chambers, sends another incomplete project to Bill Jackson, and he and Barrett Prettyman finish it. That's the Godkin Lectures that Jackson was to give at Harvard in the spring of '55. Mine's black, but it's published as a Harvard University Press book in 1955 called the Supreme Court in American Government, I think is the title. And there's another paper, a would-be article about the 1940 agreement with Great Britain exchanging U.S. destroyers for Caribbean bases, for which Jackson, as Attorney General, provided the legal advice. And I think a third thing that sort of makes its way to Bill Jackson is the Roosevelt book file. Jackson had intended to publish it with Knopf. They had published his Nuremberg books, his 1941 book, The Struggle for Judicial Supremacy. Alfred Knopf was a personal friend of his, and Jackson had talked about the project with him. Years later, Knopf writes a letter, a very sweet letter. It's one of these kind of vivid scenes, to Irene Jackson, who he has, this is like 1970, he's seen her somewhere in Washington, and he writes how nice it had been to see her again after all these years, and then he says, you know, I still have such a clear memory of the last time I saw Bob. It was in New York, he'd just been to his dentist, and he was standing on the street corner waiting for the light to change, picking his teeth with a toothpick. And I think that was probably a day, you know, in the summer of 1953, when Bob Jackson and Alfred Knopf had discussed this Roosevelt book project. And so 5 or 6 years later, around 1958, Bill Jackson mentions in a letter to Mrs. Knopf, who is the co-publisher, that, you know, he does have some various papers of his father, including some Roosevelt pieces, and, you know, maybe he'll get to it. And she says, well, you know, if you get to it, I'd love to see it. But Bill Jackson never did. He did plenty of good things with his life and his time, but he did not get back to this project. And so when Bill died in December of 1999, and I had been acquainted with him and had met and interviewed him during his lifetime, I then became acquainted with his family, and they learned what I was up to, and one of his sons-in-law mentioned all the junk that they were in the process of cleaning out, and this is one of those conversations that a person doesn't have very many moments like this in their life. He says, this is his son-in-law, Bill's son-in-law, says, you know, Bill had all kinds of stuff. He's got some drafts of his father's book about Roosevelt. And I said, oh, what do you mean by that? He said, well, I guess he wrote a book about FDR, and these are like the longhand drafts of some of the chapters. And I said, how much material are we talking about? Because I knew of the little Harvard Law Review article, and I immediately thought, you know, this is a handwritten draft of what became a 6-page Law Review article. And he said, oh, you know, 50, 80 pages. He said, it's all jumbled in a file. And I said, well, Jim, I'm not exactly sure what you're talking about, but if that's all about FDR, he never published anything like that, and this could be something pretty important. And so, you know, shortly after that, the family showed it to me, and then I began.
Did you salivate?
I salivated, hyperventilated. I don't think I jumped in the air, but I, you know, immediately said something enthusiastic, and they let me do some copying, and then eventually let me, you know, basically take temporary custody of the materials. The materials in the end will go to an appropriate repository. But I spread the stuff out on the dining room table and tried to figure out, you know, how does this page relate to all this? And, you know, eventually I found that envelope, and then I found a table of contents, and then I knew I was trying to make 8 or 9 piles, and then some of the pages were numbered, and I started to get a sense of, you know, this is about economics, that man is economist. You know, this is about politics, that man is politician. This, you know, and then you can sort of all of a sudden, you have one draft, and then you have another draft, and then you figure out which is the later draft. And out of all that, I basically, you know, put it in the right order and had what we would call a manuscript. It's probably, you know, in size, 60%, that manuscript is probably 60% of the book that Jackson would have ultimately written. In quality, it's probably 80 to 90% of the excellent prose he would have produced in the end. Some parts are pretty close to done and beautifully polished, and some parts are rougher and choppier. And so what I did was put it together in proper order, last version and so forth, and then tried to step back from it, read it with fresh eyes, evaluate it, came to the conclusions I just said about its kind of size and quality, and then thought about things that could be brought in from other unpublished Jackson writings to sort of plump it up, to augment it. And so pieces of the Columbia Oral History, which is unpublished, pieces of a draft autobiography that Jackson worked on in 1944, some snippets from different letters, things that are about FDR that either are right on point, they'll be about the same thing that he addressed in the manuscript, but they add a detail or a thought that he doesn't have in the manuscript, or things that are thematically related, if not addressed directly. And then I thought about mechanically how to bring them in and how to sort of make it visible, at least in a footnote way, so that future scholars and researchers could tell where the pieces came from. And then once I kind of had that all together, I sort of started to reach out to some friends and advisors, some serious historians who have been very generous and themselves, I think, salivating a little bit about the last New Deal memoir is what we're talking about. And with lots of people's help and advice, one of the early things that became apparent is that Jackson, writing in 1953, doesn't have to explain who Henry Stimson is.
Right.
A book in 2002 is going to need a footnote that says who Henry Stimson is. So I spent the time, and it was a pleasure. It was a fair amount of time writing all those footnotes and reading all those Roosevelt biographies and all that. It was an excuse to really spend a year in the New Deal and immerse myself in Rooseveltiana and spend time at Hyde Park and make contact with some great Roosevelt historians. And I've tried to bring into this project the benefit of all of that. And I've tried to always remain very true to the fact that this is Bob Jackson's book. And so in the end, what it is entirely, with a minor grammatical catch here and there, it's entirely his text, above the footnote line, with the exception of a couple of italicized explanatory phrases, which are obviously me. It's him. It's all him on FDR. And I've written an introduction that explains more succinctly than I've just done here what this is, who he was, where this all came from. But that's the deal.
I know it's kind of early, but you kind of view this as your seminal event here. This is the John Barrett breakout.
No, I don't have any. For myself, I don't have any grand label I put on this. It's just it's great fun to be part of finding something like this, and it's in a minor way. It's a chance to work with him in an odd way. I mean, it's kind of like he had all these great law clerks, and now I get to be his first posthumous law clerk, in a sense. And that's fun, and that's an honor, and it's obviously a big responsibility. I've tried to really kind of keep myself out of the way while doing what I can to deliver his book. That's how I kind of think about it. It obviously, is great for my work on Jackson. It, gives me a certain credibility, and I get to go along for the ride. But it's his project. And
well, just think how much fun you're going to have when you really sit down with some of these other first-hand players, being able to put them in to a context, and that's a puzzle. And frankly, they're just going to know that piece, that time period. George Niebank period. I mean, that's just a certain time period. And the Barrett Prettymans and all these other folks. But you'll ultimately be the master of the puzzle.
Well, I'll at least be the next generation or one of the next generation. I think there's actually going to be a sizable generation, which is fine. I mean, that's my sense of the importance of Jackson. I don't need to sort of hog anything here. There's more than enough for me and plenty of other people to get involved with. And this is just one thing because of the serendipity of being in the right place and in the right conversation with Jackson's grandson-in-law and granddaughters and daughter-in-law and so forth. I've been able to work on this, so it's been fun, and it's at the stage where there are a few blanks and a few more inserts and mechanics to deal with, but it's largely in form, and it's at the stage where what I intend to do is kind of get back to Knopf and see if 45 years late it might be a book they're still interested in. If not a so-called popular publisher, I think a major university press is going to be very interested in this project, and because it's FDR and because it's Jackson.
Sure, this is exciting.
Yeah, so it's.
Well, we hope that you will be able to, at some point, roll that out or have an appropriate ceremony here at the Jackson.
It would be great. Next year is actually an FDR anniversary year. He turns 120 on January 30th, 2002. So may not make it by January 30th, but maybe in the year 02.
Yeah.
On the FDR birthday cycle, a new insider account of FDR who, obviously I've sort of skipped over the content. The content is great, and the subject FDR is extremely worthy of additional study, and Jackson's an incredibly important perspective on FDR. I mean, FDR is mysterious, and I'm not sure anybody's ever going to really get inside. That was part of his power and part of his